Welcome to SchneiderB FM. This is the podcast to help you use the internet to market your school in order to achieve your enrollment goals. I'm your host, Brendan Schneider. Welcome to episode 22, where my guest today is Paul Warner. Paul is the communications director at the Lawrence School, which is located in Northeast Ohio. And the reason I invited him on the show today is because he's the main force behind their podcast, which is the LionShare Podcast. Now, in episode 21, we talked about an alumni podcast, but in this episode, I wanted to talk about a podcast that was for enrollment and retention purposes, and this podcast fits the bill. I'm very excited for you to listen to the show. I think you're going to take a lot away from it, but before we get started, let's hear from our sponsor. Do you want to know the secret to creating the best private school website? The truth is, website redesigns don't have to be long, arduous, can't wait until it's over projects. The secret to avoiding the mess? Planning. Blackbaud K-12 has some interesting ideas on improving the school website redesign process. Whether your school is looking to redesign this year or in 3 years, their new ebook, How to Design the Best Private School Website, will help you plan ahead. Please download your free copy today at my special link, SchneiderB.com/Blackbaud. Hi, Paul. Welcome to the show. Could you introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Sure. I'm the Director of Communications at Lawrence School, which is a co-ed K-12 day school located near Cleveland, Ohio. And it's specifically designed to teach students with language-based learning differences such as dyslexia and attention deficits such as ADHD. We're one of about 300 LD schools in the nation and the only school in Northeast Ohio that serves that particular profile of learners.
Fantastic. So the reason we're talking today is because you guys have created what I think is a great podcast. So I wanted to share that with other schools. So can you tell me when and why did you start the podcast?
Sure. So when is the easy part? We started the podcast last October, so it's fairly new. We have we have 5 episodes published now. The why is a little bit of a longer story. The inspiration for starting a podcast came a couple years ago when we did some market research that included focus groups with our current families. And it brought to the surface some surprising information of the families we talked to. And these are families that were huge advocates for the school. They kept saying things like, we love the school. What they do there is magic. And through that process, what we learned was, although these families really love the school and were tremendous advocates for the school, they also were admitting that they didn't have a real strong understanding of how our program actually worked. Because, obviously what we do isn't magic. It's a kind of a flattering thing to hear, I guess, and maybe good for like a pull quote on a website. But the reality is what we do at Lawrence is the result of a lot of hard work. And the value proposition of our school is predicated on understanding how our unique program and environment directly produce these results that they see in their kids. So there was clearly a problem that we needed to address. We realized we needed to be doing a better job of educating our own families. So, we initially thought about hosting a series of presentations at the school or even at a parent's home, but we hit a number of logistical speed bumps along the way that started basically with like, where and when do we host these? Lawrence School is unique in that we have 2 campuses that are separated by about 10 miles. And then on top of that, because we're the only school that offers this type of program in Northeast Ohio, we pull families from more than 90 different communities and 60 different school districts. So, where do you have these presentations? When do you have these presentations? After drop off in the evening? Because we understood that our families are incredibly spread out. We were concerned that no matter what time we picked, we weren't going to get a lot of families to come. We weren't going to reach a lot of our families. But as a result of going through this process, we discovered that we actually had a way to turn this challenge into an opportunity. Since many of our families spend a lot of time in the car getting to school, we decided, let's take advantage of that idle time by producing a podcast that will help us better educate our families and hopefully entertain them a little bit, but ultimately to take that time in the car and make the value proposition of Lawrence School more clear with our families.
Okay.
That was kind of the why in a nutshell.
That's fantastic. It's funny when you go back to, what was the phrase? It's magic happens. You guys make magic happen.
They kept on saying it's magic. Which again, like it sounds great, but it's, when you get down to it, it's really a pretty weak testimonial, so we wanted to give them some more meaningful language to use. And, like many schools, word of mouth marketing is so important for us. Parent referrals are so important for us. And if a family asks one of our current families, well, what's the difference at Lawrence? And they say it's magic, that's not really doing our program justice. So that was kind of the approach we took.
Sorry. So now they could say it's magic and ...
Right. It's magic because ... That would probably work as well.
That's better said. So one of the things I love about the show is the distinct sound that you guys have. So here's what I'm going to challenge if you're listening right now. Well, if you're out running around or doing something, you can't do it. But if you're at your desk, in the show notes, there are going to be links to some episodes. So I want you to stop our talk, go listen, and then come back to that distinctive. And then this is the distinctive sound. So what was your inspiration for the show? Because it's very different than something like what we're doing right now.
It is. The format is different. Although I will start, Brendan, by saying that, I'm a huge fan of podcasts in general. And in fact, I mentioned to you earlier that your podcast, this podcast that I'm currently on now, was actually the first podcast I listened to when I was new to independent school marketing about 5 years ago. So I blame you for all of this.
Well, you say the nicest things. Thank you.
But really, just hearing, I was really intrigued by the idea that we as school marketers could have a platform for essentially producing and publishing our own radio programs. So this is all your fault basically. But here's the other thing I'll say about podcasts. There's so many amazing podcasts out there right now. We knew for us to stand out, we had to do something that was different. More and more schools are starting to do podcasts. And, although we're thinking that, Lawrence families have a long commute, let's take advantage of that. We also understood that we're still competing for their time in the car. People listen to audiobooks, satellite radio, Pandora, other awesome podcasts. So as far as the inspiration for our sound, I'm also a huge fan of just about all the NPR podcasts. I listen to Hidden Brain, This American Life, Serial, all of that. And although I realize that we'll never have the resources or time to match what they do, I still felt that we could use a similar formula of kind of like a nonfiction story-driven narrative. And so, put simply, the vision of our podcast was to create a documentary for your ears. We wanted to do all the interviews, but we also wanted to take the listener inside of our classrooms and on our athletics fields and anywhere the story kind of led us. We wanted to have that kind of format as a way to differentiate our sound.
I love it. And when you and I kind of connected to listen to it the first time, that's what really turned me on to the show, which was I thought I was listening to NPR. I really did. And I thought, oh my God, this is so cool. Because again, thank you for the kind words about the show. But one of the things I found out is because I'm doing the podcast again, I'm listening to even more podcasts. And now that I'm doing it, I see what goes into it. So I appreciate the story. I appreciate the cuts. I appreciate how everything is put together. It makes me feel bad about this. Not my guess, but it's really good. So I'm telling people right now, stop listening to us, go listen, and then come back. But it really is well done. So you talked a little bit about the goals for the podcast. Can you go into some more detail?
Yeah. So I would say, the goal for us was pretty clear. This is a enrollment management initiative.
Okay.
We are trying to better educate our families. And like I said, to better understand the value proposition of the school with that re-enrollment in mind, the retention kind of aspect. And at the same time, we know that it's all related. The focus is really re-enrollment because that's where our audience is. We have 350 families out there that already have, are ready to hear our podcast, but it is a re-enrollment initiative. But it also touches recruitment. It also touches annual giving. And we've already started to see some of those results we've basically given these episodes to our enrollment management team, and they are using them through their email campaigns to reach prospective families. And, we try to pick topics that are specific to different types of learning differences. So that also helps our enrollment management team with their different profiles that they're looking at. I'll also add, like, another win for us is we have a donor who gives money every year who wasn't really real engaged with the school. He would just send in a check every year, which is great.
Yeah.
But, there wasn't much communication. And out of the blue, our advancement director, who actually plays a critical role in the production of our podcast, and I'll get to that in a minute, but she got a phone call from him for the first time. It was the first time she had talked to him in a few years. And he, said that the podcast was the reason for his call. And then he bumped his level of giving up significantly. So that was a nice way to see that although the focus is on enrollment management, we are touching other areas, and we seem to be on the right track with this. So
that's awesome. That's very awesome. So the goal's clear, and I think what I can glean is intended audiences. So you're talking about current parents, and it sounds like school community, and then that leaks into prospective families, correct?
That's right. Yep.
Does this play for alumni well?
We have a very young alumni base. First graduating class was 2005, and I believe it was like 4 students. So we have about 300 alumni, and that is like an opportunity to engage them. In fact, our intro, outro music is produced by one of our alums, which was one of the first decisions we made when we decided we were going to have a podcast. And we're very fortunate that he's extremely talented. And yeah, we definitely have on the horizon, alumni profiles, or we were even thinking of doing a college and career planning episode that does incorporate some of our alumni, but that's certainly an opportunity for us to expand this reach even farther.
I hear you talking about topics. You've talked a little bit about how you decide on the topics. Do you have a process? Are you guys brainstorming in a room? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And actually, this is the perfect segue to tell you a little bit more about our advancement director, who happens to be the host of our show, Jane Iben. She's an alumni parent. She's a tremendously skilled interviewer, and she really is, like I said, integral to the production process. And she also wears the hat of director of advancement. So she brings that critical perspective of knowing exactly what it's like to have a child with a learning difference. And I can honestly say the podcast would not have gotten off the ground the way it has without her collaboration. You're asking about how we choose the topics for the show. She's very much involved. It's a 50-50 kind of partnership I have with her. And over the summer, we sat down, we spent a couple of days. We basically filled up a whiteboard with a bunch of topics that we thought would be interesting. And, at Lawrence, we have this matrix that we refer to all the time. It's a 2x2. And if you can think of value on one axis and distinction on the other, we always talk about trying to live in that upper right-hand quadrant. Mm-hmm. And so as we're throwing up those topics, that was kind of the test that we put the topics through to make sure that, these were worth pursuing, because, in all honesty, they do take a lot of time. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to make sure that we're making the most of our time. But, once we threw those topics up there, we then started to look for ways to kind of group them. So if the topics were just the subjects for each podcast, we felt like by grouping them, we could provide more depth to each episode and make sure that we were covering these topics completely. And then the last step really was we brought in the director of enrollment management. And he's someone who, we use a lot for these podcasts for feedback, because he brings the feedback from the families and what he's hearing most consistently from them. What are their concerns? What could he use to address some of these concerns as he's talking to families? Because we really wanted to make sure that we weren't just simply producing what we wanted to say, but rather kind of, what topics would be most beneficial to the enrollment management team. Because at the end of the day, this is an enrollment management initiative. So it's a collaborative process, but that's kind of how we get our ducks in a row and we decide which episodes we're going to do next.
I mean, besides the one donor, which is a fabulous story of raising more money, what's been the feedback? Do you have any other anecdotal stories or metrics?
You know what? Yeah, we're actually working on our 6th episode now.
Okay.
We had a parent in, and I'll use air quotes to say our podcast studio, which really is just my office and a table that's in the middle of the room. But we had her in to interview her, and just as she was walking out the door, she was talking about how much she enjoyed the podcast, but then she specifically referenced one of the things we mentioned in our first episode about, what makes our classrooms and our learning environment so unique, to one of her friends as a way to explain to them exactly what is unique at Lawrence. And it was just one of those moments of, wow, this is proof that, at least in one instance, that this is actually happening. That was like the perfect story to hear, because that was our goal. And she's a current family, and she then is hearing something from the podcast and then able to articulate it to a family who is not familiar with the school and wanting to learn more.
Okay, that's very cool. So the next logical path or questioning we have to do is, I'm a marketer, I'm an admission person listening to this show. You've sold me. So let's talk about the process. How do you produce this? How do you make the magic happen, at least with the podcast?
It's not magic, Brendan. It's a lot of hard work. So yeah, we get the topic. Once we have figured out, all right, this is what we're going to approach next. The next step is to identify who on campus we'd like to speak with, and that's kind of the fun part, because we, as school marketers, we are all on campuses that are full of experts in their field, and so it's just identifying who we want to talk to and setting up those interview times, and then recording the interviews. And once we have that raw audio, I take all the audio and then I start editing them down into sound bites that I think are most interesting. And then I have software that I use to begin to map out kind of the narrative. And it's similar to like what you might use for a video for iMovie. It's a program that I use called Hindenburg. So we map out that timeline, and then the host of the show comes in and we work together, and we start to write transitions, we record them, we re-record them, we kind of work through that storyline. And then oftentimes the last step is she brilliantly writes this amazing intro that sets the whole tone for the episode, and off we go. But then after that, there's quite a bit of editing, or different revisions we go through. We then give it to, make sure our director of enrollment management listens to it, and we get some feedback from him, and there may be some changes there. We share it with the head of school, and then once everyone's comfortable with where we're at, then we go ahead and publish.
How long is that process for you from, I don't want to say concept because I know you guys brainstorm, but once you decide on the topic and you're going to start recording to publish, how long do you think that is?
So here's the bad news. No, it's actually, it's never as fast as I want it to be, but I would say honestly, on average, each episode is about maybe 10 days, a week to 10 days. And that's really because, this is not our full-time job. We all have day-to-day responsibilities that need to be done. And so it's, carving out an hour here or 2 hours here or 4 hours there. And, I would say, generally speaking, a couple days to get all the interviews, and then a day to kind of break down all the audio clips. And then the rest of the time is just kind of building out that narrative and working on transitions and writing pieces that need to be written, and then working on the intro. So yeah, I would say on average about a week to 10 days.
Has that gotten shorter for you as you guys have gone along?
So it has.
So as you get better, it's good, but as you guys get better, you'll become more efficient, I assume?
Absolutely. Yeah. That first episode took forever. I lost track of how long it took, but it took a long time. But you're right. And it's just like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And I also think that we've become more deliberate about the people we interview and the type of questions we ask. We talk about, okay, who can we talk to who would bring a different perspective to this, or even just after we pick the topic, the host and I will often discuss, like, so here's the topic. This is why it's living in that upper right-hand quadrant, but what is it specifically that we're trying to say with regard to our audience of being current families. And so I think that process has certainly evolved from that first episode where we were just like, let's figure out how these microphones work, and let's see if I'm able to edit this audio down the way we want to. And I will say there was a lot of YouTube watching. There was a lot of Googling questions about how to edit audio. But yeah, that you're right about that. That process has gotten much more streamlined since that first episode.
So you don't have a background at NPR?
I do not, although I will say that, our director of advancement is a Renaissance woman. She actually did do some freelance work with NPR, in addition to being an educator, and she's just like wildly talented and really a key to the podcast so far. So we're very fortunate to have her.
Well, that's fantastic. But, kind of making the joke about you being an NPR, I hope people understand that, Paul's done this. You can do this. Paul started and he's taught himself. And when you hear the results, you got to jump in. And I applaud you guys for doing it. So as we work to wind down here, any tips or tricks or lessons that you've learned in your time that you can share with somebody who might be thinking about, God, this is overwhelming?
Yeah. And honestly, it was overwhelming for me for a while. We actually had the podcast equipment for several months, and it was just kind of sitting there because it did seem daunting. But, our podcast is proof. You have to commit to it. And that expression, where there's a will, there's a way. I would modify that and say, where there's a will and access to internet, there's a way. I think you can learn a lot just by Googling and watching YouTube videos. That's certainly how I did a lot of my research, and also just by doing it. I do think that we've gotten a little bit better from a production standpoint from episode 1 to episode 5. But as far as, advice to share, and it is kind of funny because it's like last October, I was just as new to this as anyone else. But for us, it was really important to, and I'm going to channel my best Simon Sinek here, but it was really important to think about the why. And that was one of the reasons why the podcast equipment just kind of sat there for a while, because I couldn't wrap my head around, is this a recruitment piece? And if it is, like, how am I going to get this out to families? And, what was the specific purpose? But like I said, as a result of this market research that we had done, and it just kind of seemed to align. And, given the challenge of having our families so far apart, it made a lot of sense to us. So, I would say, think about what is the purpose of producing a podcast. If you're producing a podcast just because your rival school has one, I'm not sure that's going to be the best use of your time. Just thinking about the why, I think, is really important.
No, that's really good advice because, podcasting is fun. It's cool, but you can burn out and it never stops. So you have to understand why. So that's great advice. But again, I want people to understand, and Paul, I appreciate the kind of the full transparency and the realness that you had the equipment and it sat there.
Yeah.
Which is life.
Right.
People are busy. People have families. I've often joked that, especially at schools, especially people in Marcom, things are added to our plate and they're never removed. So it's trying to manage all that. So I applaud you guys again for doing that. But final question, and I just want people to know that podcast episodes, links that we've talked about, Paul's been really kind to share some equipment that he's using. I'll put that in the show notes as well. But my final question is, where's the best place for listeners to find you or find out more about the podcast, or both?
Sure. I'm always happy to talk about our podcast or our process or even the equipment that we use. You can reach me at pwarner@lawrenceschool.org.
Great. We'll do that. Paul, I can't thank you enough, and I can't wait for the next episode.
I'm excited. Thanks for having us on, and appreciate all the work that you do for independent school marketers.
Thank you for listening. But before you go, can I ask a favor? I would love for you to leave an honest review of this show on iTunes. Reviews are the way that more people can find the show, and we can get the word out, and we can help more people market their school. I've made it easy for you, so if you go to SchneiderB.com/iTunes, it'll take you right where you need to leave the review. So thanks very much, and until next episode.